Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. In industries like mining, there's this constant push, this drive to do things better, to make them more efficient.
Absolutely.
And one of the biggest challenges they face, think about it. You're digging up massive amounts of rock and trying to separate the valuable stuff from the waste.
Yeah.
You can't just grind everything down to dust.
Yeah.
It's just not practical or economical.
Right.
And that's where this really cool process called flotation comes in.
Yeah.
It uses bubbles to selectively attach to the minerals you want and lift them away.
It's a really neat process, and it works great, especially for those fine particles.
Right.
But when you start dealing with larger particles, those coarse particles, things get a lot trickier. The traditional models we've relied on for so long, they don't always give us the full story.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. How do we understand what makes some of those big chunks float while others sink?
Yeah, that's the key question.
Without that understanding, well, it's going to be tough to optimize things, to make the process more efficient and sustainable.
It all comes back to that fundamental understanding.
And to help us get there, a listener actually sent us 2 papers. They're tackling this challenge head-on, looking at a brand new method for assessing how well those coarse particles are floating. So, listener, this deep dive is for you.
It's all about answering your question.
Our mission today is to break down this new methodology. We're going to go through these papers step by step. We're going to look at the scientific arguments they're making and how this approach is shaking things up in the world of flotation science.
It's really interesting stuff.
We'll also try to be critical. We're going to look for any potential gaps, any blind spots or areas where more research might be needed.
We want to give you the complete picture.
Okay, so let's get to those papers. The first one is titled, A New Method for Assessing Coarse Particle Flotation Performance, Part 1, on the Deconvolution of the Flotation Response. And the second one is, of course, Part 2, which is called A New Method for Assessing Coarse Particle Flotation Performance, Part 2, Assessment of Reproducibility Using Data from a Mechanical Cell.
So to give you some background, these papers are building on some really neat work by Crompton and others from back in 2023. They developed a new algorithm that looks at this thing called the flotation rate constant. Basically, this is a measure of how quickly a particle attaches to a bubble and floats.
All right, like how eager it is to float.
Exactly. And what was clever is that they normalized this rate by the theoretical maximum rate, assuming the whole particle was made of the valuable mineral. This ratio, they argued, gives us a good idea of how much of that valuable mineral is actually exposed on the surface of the particle, what we call surface liberation.
So how well it can actually attach to the bubbles.
Exactly. They tested this algorithm initially on a pretty cool device called the CoarseAIR.
Okay, so in Part 1, what was the problem they were trying to solve? What was missing in our understanding of coarse particle flotation?
Well, the thing is, coarse particles are kind of a mixed bag. They vary in size, of course, but also in how much of that valuable mineral is actually exposed on their surfaces. A large particle with a lot of the mineral exposed is going to float much differently than a particle of the same size where the mineral is mostly hidden inside.
So it's not just about size, it's also about that exposure.
Right. And that means that using a single rate constant, or even just a few, to describe how all these particles behave, it's an oversimplification.
Right, it's not capturing the full complexity.
Exactly. And this oversimplification can lead to inefficiencies in the flotation process.
So how have we traditionally dealt with this complexity? How have scientists been trying to understand and model this variation?
So for a long time, we've relied on mathematical models to describe the flotation process. These models typically use something called a rate constant, which basically tells you how fast the mineral floats.
Okay, so a higher rate constant means faster floating.
Yeah. And in the past, we often used a single rate constant, or maybe just a handful, to describe the flotation kinetics of the valuable particles. It's like assuming that all the particles we want to float will do so at roughly the same speed.
Okay, but that doesn't sound very realistic, especially with these coarse particles.
You're right. It's a simplification. And scientists have recognized for a while that there's actually a whole spectrum of rate constants within a typical particle population.
Because of that surface exposure issue.
Exactly. So to try and capture this variation, researchers started using probability distributions, things like bell curves, Gaussian, flat distributions, rectangular, or skewed distributions, gamma, to represent this spread of rate constants.
Okay, so instead of one rate constant, they used a distribution of them.
Exactly. And these distributions, they use a few parameters to describe the shape and spread of these rate constants.
So what was the issue with these earlier attempts to use these distributions? What was scientifically lacking?
The main issue is that choosing which type of distribution to use, whether it's a Gaussian, rectangular, or gamma, was often a bit arbitrary. There wasn't always a strong theoretical justification for picking one over the other.
So it was a bit subjective.
Yeah, it was more a matter of finding a mathematical function that could reasonably fit the data. But the choice of distribution, it could actually significantly influence how we interpret the results. And different researchers might pick different distributions for the same data, which could lead to different conclusions.
So that lack of objectivity was a problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so that brings us to the new algorithm in part 1. What's the big scientific leap they're proposing?
Well, their key innovation is a more objective way to determine this continuous distribution of rate constants. They don't force the data to fit a predefined mathematical shape. Instead, they use a process called deconvolution to extract the distribution directly from the experimental data.
Deconvolution. That sounds intense. What exactly is that?
Think of it like this. Imagine you have a blurry photograph. Deconvolution is kind of like taking that blurry picture and using math to figure out what the sharp, clear image should have looked like.
So it's like removing the blur.
Right. In this case, the blurry picture is the overall flotation response, how much mineral is recovered over time. And the sharp image we want to uncover is the true distribution of rate constants within that particle population.
So they're letting the data speak for itself rather than imposing a preconceived shape on it.
Exactly.
But how do they ensure they're not just overfitting the data, finding patterns that aren't really there?
That's where their simplest possible functional form approach comes in.
Okay, break that down for me.
The algorithm basically tries to find the smoothest possible distribution that still fits the data. It only allows peaks or sharp changes in the distribution if the data really demands it.
So it avoids making things more complicated than they need to be.
Right. It's like Occam's razor for flotation kinetics.
I like that.
The simplest explanation is usually the best.
Now, they also talk about redefining the maximum rate constant, Kmax. What's the thinking behind that?
Traditionally, Kmax was often treated as just a normalization factor, a way to scale the rate constants. But in this new work, they give it a more physically meaningful definition.
Okay, what do they define it as?
They define it as a weighted average rate constant at the very beginning of the flotation process as time approaches zero.
So it reflects the behavior of the most easily floatable particles.
Exactly. It's grounded in the actual initial behavior of the system.
Okay, I see. So it's not just a theoretical limit. It's based on real-world observations.
Right.
Now, there's also this partition curve, PK, that they talk about. What does that tell us from a scientific perspective?
The partition curve is a really useful tool. It tells us the probability of a particle with a certain rate constant ending up in the concentrate, the good stuff, after a given amount of time.
So it's like a prediction of where the particle will end up.
Exactly. And what's really neat is that they use dimensionless values for both the rate constant and time, which means we can compare different systems directly, even if they have different operating conditions.
So it's a way to normalize things and see the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Now, in part 1, they apply this algorithm to data from the CoarseAIR device. Were there any special considerations they had to take into account when analyzing that data?
Yes. There was one potential issue specific to devices like the CoarseAIR, which is that it's a small diameter fluidized bed.
Okay, what does that mean in practical terms?
Well, in a fluidized bed, you have air bubbling up through a bed of particles.
Right.
But because the diameter of the CoarseAIR is relatively small, particles near the wall of the device might not have the same chance to interact with the air bubbles as particles in the center.
So there might be some particles essentially bypassing the flotation process.
Exactly. It's called a wall effect.
Interesting. So how did they account for this potential wall effect?
They introduced a factor called hydrodynamic efficiency into their calculations. This factor basically represents the proportion of particles that are actually experiencing the full flotation process.
So it's a way to adjust for those particles that might be slipping through the cracks.
Right. It's a way to account for the non-ideal behavior.
Okay, so how did they actually implement this whole deconvolution process? What did they use?
They actually used Microsoft Excel. Now, I know that sounds a bit surprising.
Yeah, Excel doesn't exactly scream cutting-edge scientific analysis.
True, but Excel actually has a pretty powerful tool called Solver, which can be used for optimization.
So it can find the best solution to a problem, given certain constraints.
Exactly. They used Solver to find the distribution of rate constants that best fit the experimental data, while also keeping the distribution as smooth as possible.
Okay, so they combine the power of Excel with their own clever algorithm.
Right.
So what did they find when they applied this to the CoarseAIR feed sample? What were the scientifically important results?
Well, they found that the distribution of rate constants wasn't overly complicated. It had a fairly simple shape with a single peak and then a gradual decrease on either side.
So most of the particles had rate constants clustered around that peak.
Exactly. And importantly, when they used this distribution to calculate the expected flotation response, it matched the actual experimental data really well.
So the model accurately predicted what they observed in the real world.
Right. That's always a good sign. And when they looked at the rate constants for different size fractions within the feed, they found some consistent trends.
What kind of trend?
Finer particles, as you might expect, had higher rate constants.
Meaning they float more easily.
Exactly. Which aligns with what we already know about flotation.
So the finer particles have more surface area exposed, and they attach to bubbles more readily.
Right.
Now, did the results hold up when they considered all those different size fractions together?
Yes, they did. They tested this by taking the distributions for each individual size fraction, weighting them according to how much of each size was present in the overall feed, and then adding them all together. And what they found was that this combined distribution matched the distribution they got when they analyzed the entire feed as a single sample.
So it all added up nicely.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which gives us more confidence that the method is working as it should.
Okay, what about the partition curve results for the CoarseAIR? How did those compare to what they'd found before?
Well, the partition curve they got using this new algorithm, which is based on a more rigorous understanding of flotation kinetics, it was actually different from the partition curve they had used in the past, which was based on an equation adapted from gravity separation.
So different underlying principles leading to different results.
Right. And this highlights how important it is to use the right theoretical framework when you're trying to understand a process like flotation.
Because different principles can lead you down different paths. Okay, so they have this new kinetic analysis. How did that compare to more traditional methods of assessing mineral liberation, like QuemScan?
They did a qualitative comparison between the results from their kinetic analysis and data from QuemScan, which is a technique that directly measures the mineral exposure on the surface of particles.
So one is looking at flotation behavior, and the other is looking at the physical characteristics of the particles.
Right, and what they found was that there was a good degree of agreement between the two approaches.
So the rate constant, which they derive from the flotation data, seems to be a good indicator of how well the mineral is liberated.
Exactly. It's another piece of evidence that supports their method.
So what are the main scientific takeaways from part one?
The big takeaway is that they've developed a more objective and robust way to characterize how particles behave in flotation. It's based on solid theoretical principles and produces results that align with what we see in the real world. And it gives us a more complete picture of the flotation process, especially for those tricky coarse particles.
Okay, so I was about introducing the algorithm and showing that it works. Now, part two is about reproducibility, which is crucial in science.
Right. You always want to make sure your results aren't just a fluke.
Exactly. So what was the main scientific question they were trying to answer in part two?
They wanted to know just how reproducible this new method is. They didn't want to repeat those large-scale experiments with the CoarseAIR multiple times because that's expensive and time-consuming.
Makes sense.
So they used a different approach. They used a batch mechanical cell to simulate the flotation process under very controlled conditions.
They scaled things down to make the experiments more manageable.
Right. And they argued that this batch cell could actually be interpreted as a representation of a continuous steady-state process, which is what we're ultimately interested in.
So even though it's a different setup, it can still give us valuable insights.
Exactly.
Okay, but how did they make sure these mechanical cell experiments were still scientifically valid?
They went to great lengths to ensure consistency and minimize any potential sources of error. They had a very specific protocol for crushing the ore to get a consistent particle size distribution. They used nitrogen-saturated water to prevent the minerals from oxidizing, which could affect their flotation behavior. And they even had a very careful subsampling procedure to make sure they were testing representative samples.
So they really paid attention to the details.
Absolutely. They wanted to make sure their results were rock solid.
Okay, so what did these batch cell tests actually involve? How did they generate the data?
For each experimental run, they took a representative sample and did a flotation test in the batch cell. They measured how much material floated over time to generate their flotation response curve.
Okay.
Then they took another identical sample and ran a separate test for just 3 minutes. The material that floated in those 3 minutes was considered their simulated product, and the stuff that didn't float was the simulated reject.
Okay, so they created their own product and reject streams.
Right. And then they analyzed these simulated streams separately to see how they behaved in flotation.
Okay, and the big question. How consistent were the results across those multiple runs?
They did 8 runs in total, but they had to discard one of the runs because it looked like the sample might have oxidized before they tested it.
So even with all that careful preparation, things can still go wrong.
Yeah, it happens. But for the remaining 7 runs, the results were very consistent. The flotation response curves for the feed material were very similar, and the calculated distributions of rate constants were also very reproducible.
So that's good news for the reliability of the method.
It is. And even when they looked at specific size fractions within the feed, the results were still very consistent across the runs.
Okay, what about the simulated product and reject streams? Were those consistent too?
Yes, the results for the product and reject streams were also very reproducible. And importantly, the model they developed accurately predicted the flotation behavior of both the product and the reject.
So the model was able to capture the separation process quite well.
Right.
Now, they also looked at how the average rate constant changed over time. What did that tell them?
By tracking the average rate constant, they could see how the floatability of the material changed as the flotation process went on, and they found that these changes were also very consistent across the runs.
So the overall kinetics of the process were reproducible.
Exactly.
And what about the mass balance? Did the amount of material in the product and reject streams add up to the original amount of feed?
Yes. When they accounted for the different proportions of product and reject, the distributions of rate constants for those 2 streams added up nicely to the distribution for the original feed.
So no material mysteriously disappeared or appeared during the process.
Right. Everything was accounted for. And unlike the results from the CoarseAIR in Part 1, they didn't see any evidence of a wall effect in the batch cell.
Which makes sense, because the batch cell is well mixed, so all the particles have a chance to interact with the bubbles.
Right.
Now, what about that all-important partition curve? How reproducible was that?
The partition curve was very reproducible. They averaged the results from the 6 good runs, and the variation was very small. And the average values they got for Kmax and that dimensionless time, they were very similar to the values they had obtained from the CoarseAIR experiments.
So the key parameters seem to be pretty consistent across different systems.
Right.
And they did a similar analysis for the individual size fractions, right?
Yes, they looked at the distributions and partition curves for 3 different size ranges. And again, the results were very consistent across the runs. They also found that the coarser particles had lower K50 kilomax values, which means they were less selectively recovered.
Which makes sense because the coarser particles tend to have less mineral exposed on their surfaces.
Exactly.
Okay, they also discussed using a mechanical cell to represent a continuous process. What were the key points there?
They emphasize that from a chemical engineering perspective, a series of batch reactors, which is what a mechanical cell approximates, can be used to model a continuous plug flow reactor under certain conditions.
So it's a valid way to simulate a continuous process.
Right. They also highlighted the importance of the dimensionless time. They argued that it's a really useful measure of flotation performance because it allows you to compare different systems directly, regardless of their size or specific operating conditions.
So it's a way to normalize things and see the bigger picture.
Right.
Okay, so the big takeaway from Part 2 is that this new method is reproducible.
Absolutely. The results were consistent across multiple experiments, which gives us confidence that this method is a reliable tool for understanding coarse particle flotation.
All right, listener. So we've been through a lot. What are the key things you should take away from this deep dive?
Well, the main takeaway is that there's now a new, more objective and robust way to assess how well those tricky, coarse particles are floating.
It's not just about guessing a shape for the distribution of rate constants anymore.
Exactly. It's about letting the data tell us what that distribution looks like. And the evidence suggests that this new method is reliable and produces consistent results.
It's a pretty big deal for anyone working with flotation, especially if they're dealing with those larger particles.
Absolutely. It has the potential to significantly improve the efficiency and sustainability of mineral processing.
So listener, as you go about your day, think about how this idea of distributed rate constants in objective analysis could apply to your own field. Whether you're a scientist, an engineer, or just someone curious about the world, there's always room for a fresh perspective.
And as we wrap up, here's something to ponder. Given that this new method works so well in the lab, what are the next steps in applying it to real-world industrial settings? How can we take this knowledge and translate it into better, more efficient flotation processes?
Those are great questions to think about. And if you have any research papers or topics you'd like us to explore in a future deep dive, please send them our way. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those important questions.